for those of us who have rumblings that are deeply sacred whispers from within us of there must be something else available to me and to all of us. Those silent, subtle, but very, very powerful whispers must be listened to, given space. And oftentimes that requires acts of courage, great acts of courage, right? Leaving things behind, maybe for some period of time finding isolation because the others around us don't understand or don't see, the vision.
Welcome, beautiful souls. If you want to support this show, please join our membership, which you can find out more about at allthatweare.org/support. Our next member soul space is on the 27th of December, which is the full moon, and can also be a good time to reconnect in amongst all that the end of the year and the holidays can bring up. We just had a really beautiful soul space that was really focused on connecting to the resilience of our hearts and permission to embody versions of ourselves that are strong and rooted, and that power in our hearts and our humanity. It is a challenging time, and I want to share with you these words that a friend shared recently from Vandana Shiva on how she continues to do the work that she does. She says, "Well, it's a mystery because you don't know why you get depleted or recharged. But this much I know. I do not allow myself to be overcome by hopelessness, no matter how tough the situation. I believe that if you just do your little bit without thinking of the bigness of what you stand against, if you turn to the enlargement of your own capacities, just that itself creates new potential. As I've learnt from the Bhagavad Gita and other teachings of our culture to detach myself from the results of what I do, because those are not in my hands. The context is not in your control, but your commitment is yours to make, and you can make the deepest commitment with a total detachment about where it will take you. You want it to lead to a better world, and you shape your actions and take full responsibility for them. But then you have detachment. And that combination of deep passion and deep detachment allows me to take on the next challenge because I don't cripple myself. I don't tie myself in knots. I function like a free being. I think getting that freedom is a social duty because I think we owe it to each other not to burden each other with prescription and demands. I think what we owe each other is a celebration of life and to replace fear and hopelessness with fearlessness and joy. My guest this week is Ebyan Zanini Chimba, a writer, visual storyteller, and poetess of Somali-Italian descent. She is the founder of Mother Tongue and teaches at the intersection of decolonisation, eco-sensuality, and feminine mysticism. Ebyan's offerings are deeply inspired by the animist spirituality of her Nubian ancestral heritage, weaving us closer to the enchantment that is available in all life. In this episode entitled The Art of Activism, we explore the themes of matriarchal leadership, collective liberation, and sacred activism as we speak to the question, how can we flourish new forms of activism and leadership to create collective liberation? Some of what we learn and unlearn here are antidotes to oppressive systems, medicines of collective liberation, redefining activism into forms of daily practice and art as activism, harnessing guilt and shame as powerful emotions to guide us through transitions and birthing new worlds, collective expansion of resilience, non-binary consciousness, how to be a sacred activist at a time of genocide. At the start of the conversation, you hear Ebyan's spoken word on war and peace with music by Estas Tone. We hope that this episode helps you anchor yourself into how you can show up in these times. Welcome to All That We Are with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies, to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible.
Since when has war been synonymous to human? What caused our hearts to crust over that we would justify the smell of burning children? Hate is a spirit that looks for bodies to inhibit and call home, gives them reason and false scripture to justify the prison of their own soul. And through the windows of wounding it travels from one heart to another. Contagious like a virus and hungry like a ghost, it desires to reproduce itself and find a new host. No one ever wins a war, I thought. And yet, did war not have to be fought for the slaves to be freed and for the Jews to now walk the streets of Germany? What would it be like if peace and justice reigned from the river to the sea? Perhaps it starts with us believing it can be, believing in another kind of humanity. But habits die hard, and where would we even start when these ones have lived for centuries? Who of you truly believes that peace is possible? That amends can be made, and that those bruised and abused break the cycle of becoming the legacy of the enemy that they hate? Sometimes kindness has led to our destruction, and then we spend so long picking up the pieces of our shattered selves, we decide to close the door on compassion and understanding. Instead, we gather our roars and take to the streets, pick the side that best represents me. And who can blame them? Neutrality can be as much an atrocity as any. Paradox reigns in this strange human life. So are there ever any answers to anything? When you have been suffocated for years, are you meant to hug them into letting you breathe? What wars do we wage in the nation states of our lives where we can practice our liberal theories? No life is more valuable than another. We are all fingers of the same hand. There is only one God who wears Halloween costumes in the name of different religions. So does God also play dress up in the form of suited men giving orders to take lives they have no idea what it took to bring in? Here we are, finally arrived somewhere. If the people in power had wombs that had to stretch to the size of a balloon to bring in the life of a child who would later not listen to them, perhaps then they would know a thing or two about love, the price of life, and that everyone everywhere was once somebody's baby. If the ones making decisions of great collective significance were those whose bodies had to reach in the stars for the strength it took to bring down from God the life of someone somewhere who is now bleeding, the world would be a very different place if we chose mothers to take the space of the men in power. It's been 4,000 years of a lack of creativity, and we are tired of recreating the wheel of suffering. How many merry-go-rounds will it take until we stare it in the face and say enough? It is time to dream up other possibilities.
Ebyan, it is a delight to welcome you to all that we are. Thank you for coming here and sharing with us.
Yeah, it's my absolute honor. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, everyone says that, which always makes me laugh. And always, it happens somewhat in the right time.
Absolutely.
What are the futures of your wildest dreams?
I love this question. I'm going to speak collectively first, because if I were to speak personally, it would be an incomplete sentence, because the collective, as we all know now, is affecting all of us personally and affecting our children. So I see a future that has matriarchal leadership, where the majority of the people in power are women and other underrepresented historically people. So that would include queer, trans, global South, and Indigenous leaders. And one of the reasons that I see this as a deeply paradigm shifting reality and opening doors of possibility for our species is that we have historically for 20 to 25,000 years had matriarchal power systems. And the actual definition of power within those systems is very different from what we know now from the last 4,000 years of patriarchy. So oftentimes when I say that, people think what it means is women in power controlling over men, and that there is no space for anything in between any of the gender expressions. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because the paradigm shift that happens under matriarchal leadership is not just a replication of patriarchal values. And during the history of 20 to 25 years of human society, there was no evidence of weapons of war, and there was no evidence of inequality in the burial rights between men and women in these societies. So anthropologically, right, looking at burial rights helps us to see how people were designated in terms of equality or inequality. And that fact illuminates one of the key differences between a matriarchally led society, which is that true leadership is not self-serving. It is not serving only itself and the few loved ones around it, or its people even. It's actually for and connected to what is the greatest good and the well-being of all possible. I start there because I think any other attempt to envision a future would only get usurped by the current power paradigm and leadership and governance that we have in place. And so there's many other, branches of that, right? There's localized futures that I would also deeply encourage, and decentralizing both governance and currency. There's a lot of the importance of representation of global South leaders and Indigenous leaders in conversations for the health of our species and our planet and the future that we're walking into together. And oftentimes those voices are tokenized or not in equal proportion to the white male voices in leadership and power and decision making in our world. And there's an importance in that. So the last thing that I want to say about that is, because I will probably mention white and male other times in this podcast. And what I would like to clarify in this is that the imprints of colonialism, extractivism, and capitalism that are spread from Eurocentric values has been represented mostly by white male. And yet that does not mean that that's all that those words mean. There's also the possibility of redefining what it means to be white, redefining what it means to be a male. And there's actually a beautiful path forward. And I'm so grateful to have representatives like that in my life personally and also in the world, where it is not that those words are synonymous with domination or cruelty or violence or extractivism. It's that historically that's what we've seen. And if we say anything else, then we are basing our envisionings off of, a lie or an illusion, rather than just keeping it real and growing from that place. And so for those out there who are redefining, who are looking into allyship, who are understanding the importance of not centralizing certain voices and what it means to hold power and privilege, and the pyramid of value in our society, they are heroes of our times also. And it's an ironic thing. Even someone born in a white male body, it can be a heroic act to not take center stage and instead to give the space to others less represented. So there are these strange redefinitions happening also. What does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to use our power and our privilege for transformation collectively? And it's a beautiful path, and it's also a word, or let's say an identity that is being recreated in our times, and it's not a blanket statement of all white men out there.
Absolutely. And I feel it's really important at this time that we mature in the way that we see things and the way that we understand power and how power dynamics and oppression within power structures has affected us all. And it's really not a time that's about labeling people as good or bad, but it's a place of calling us all into a deeper humanity where we can all become more free from these systems.
Yeah, and also systems including what we learn culturally and in our family lives, and the differences between what we learn from intact Indigenous cultures, the values within that, and what we learn from the globalized culture or dominant culture, it's called sometimes, that is another form of colonialism, and one of the phrases or words or terms that I love for this is cognitive imperialism. And so even recognizing that some of these values that have been spread throughout the world, it's not that it is now solely in Europe or in the US, right? It is all over and affecting Indigenous people across the world. And the modernization that has happened through globalization also is the modernization of the mind. So cognitive imperialism being what we value in terms of ways of thinking and perceiving, versus what do we devalue. And so as a modern society, generally intuition has been devalued, emotional intelligence has been devalued, and there's reclamations of many of these things. And I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to study within our own makeup. There's the societal study, but then there's also the family study of how our people, through their lineage, whether they have been part of a historically oppressed people or part of historically oppressing people, to study within that lineage what have been the marks or the scars of modernity. That allows us to have a step ahead over what might run our system otherwise if we didn't hold that awareness, what would run our decisions, our way of relating to nature, to others, and allows us to begin to birth an antidote that starts with our own study of ourselves and the antidote we need, and then also to begin to share and spread the different ingredients of each of our antidotes coming together is also what is creating a greater medicine for the whole of the species in the world.
I love being in this space of vision of what's possible. And then we also find ourselves in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that there's so many things at the moment. And I shared a meme that was like, most of my exercise at the moment is shaking my head in disbelief. And I'm really feeling that. There's so many things. It's just like, what? Like, really? Is this where we are? One of those things that really hit me was this notion that using the word decolonization has been banned from X, what was formerly Twitter, because it's inciting like hate and violence.
I can't even. Okay. I'm so glad you started with like one of the strongest ones, right? It's just so absurd. It's not absurd at all, right? It's almost like textbook, but then when it actually starts to happen in our world, and when the the veils of this illusion that Western liberalism or democracy held in many of our psyches for some time. And I think many of us have little by little started to feel these veils getting removed one by one. But now we're in a moment where it is so real and raw that we can no longer lie to ourselves, right? Like this level of censorship, this level of manipulation for a majority of people, I'm not going to say all, but the majority of people who are speaking, and I'm going to say the name because it's important, Free Palestine, right? The majority of people who are speaking this are speaking to save lives. They're not speaking to kill, to annihilate. And there's censorship of that, of the protests in different forms, right? The vocalization in different forms of the end of oppression, but also a very life-centered movement that is now spread globally. There's when I saw this, what Elon Musk shared, I wrote in response to that exact comment that colonizer math says freeing the oppressed means annihilating the oppressor. The decolonized mind says there is enough freedom to feed us all. And that's the key difference here. What's happening with even the statement from the river to the sea, right, is banned because the assumption is that that means the genocide of all of Israeli people, as if that's the only option available. And the reason that that's this manipulation and twisting of that is happening, and it feels absolutely insane to any of us who are speaking for saving the lives of the Palestinian people and ending the occupation, is that this is the definition of projection. This is what's happening. This is like government projection with the power to censor. And so projection meaning, because that's what has been in the conscious of those supporting Israel's actions right now, that it is allowed, it is justified to mass murder innocents, including children, right? Because it's allowed there, they think that a counter movement is going to come from that same consciousness and is calling for a genocide of them. And so the idea that we can stand for a free Palestine and for decolonization without wanting to annihilate another population, even if we do not agree with them, even if they have made horrendous mistakes as a collective, that reality is part of an example of what it means to decolonize the mind. It's like literally impossible for some in this dialogue, the supporters from within Israel and externally, to wrap their head around that possibility. But it's deeply important that we continue to illuminate and not stop using these terms. Take the consequences that are needed. Be strategic, obviously, right? I know that it is a privilege for many people to say, hey, I'm not going to accept a job that doesn't allow me to speak out for Palestine, and others might not have that possibility, but for as much as possible to continue to speak these terms and this liberation movement, even when it is being censored, even when there is punishment, unjustly so, because this is a turning point for our times, and they wouldn't be censoring it if it weren't important and effective and true. Like, that's how we're onto something. One of the biggest examples of our moment of the absurdity, and that shaking our head in disbelief. And, I'm with you, and so many of us, it's just like, how on earth? We knew, right? This isn't new. It's what's happening in Israel and Palestine is not new. It's not new historically, and it's not new in present day. But there is a lot that's happening that is new. For example, how there's another meme that said, remember when we used to think that stupidity was because of the lack of information available? Well, we have the internet, and it's still not that. So it's not actually the case that people don't know what's happening, that they're not seeing the live on the ground footage of what is happening to these people. That is not the problem. There's something else that has created this in different forms. One of them that I want to acknowledge is that the Jewish people are deeply marginalized, displaced people historically for a long time. So what we are seeing is also fear and ancestral pain and trauma that has split in a way within that community. That same ancestral trauma in some part of the community is making them so aware of what is happening and to speak out against it because it's never again for anyone, anywhere. And to the other side, they are blind to these parallels and to the cycle of suffering and oppression, which is happening now. And they're blind to it because of the fear and the need for safety that they don't know is possible any other way. And so I think that's a very powerful part of all of this also to look into is what are some of the root causes that have brought us here in order to really, just like taking weeds out, to address them at the root.
And the narratives that we are receiving, there are so many Jewish people around the world and Israeli citizens that do not want what is happening currently to be happening and do not see this as a path. It's hard to find those posts and images, but I've seen them, and I have seen Jewish Israeli citizens holding up placards saying there is no military solution to this. And many of those same people were protesting months ago because they were not happy with the fascist right-wing government that they were experiencing. And we are here in this place where there is such a rise in fascism, in the right wing, in the divisive, and it feels very out of tune with where many of the human beings that I know, that I've met through my life, where they are at. And I feel like that's part of where this disbelief comes from. It sounds naive to say, but you know, I used to work in politics and I used to believe in the institutions that we had that would mean that things like this wouldn't still happen. And it's not to say that I didn't know that these things were still happening. I myself have been to the West Bank and spent time there. And I've walked through the checkpoints and all of it. And I've heard the gun battles at night. And I have experienced just a very, very small snippet of that reality. I know that the technology that we're using right now to have this conversation is causing this conflict in the Congo. And I don't understand fully why, because, you know, I think we all want to live in a world where we're like, great, they've got resources. We want to use this resources. Let's pay them for those resources and let's all benefit from all of this. And that's not the reality that we live in. And I feel that that in itself is very hard for us as human beings in our hearts to process and to recognize at a really, really base level.
Absolutely. We are in times of transition as a human species, right? So that could be times of transition to a destructive era and an era of collapse, and it could be times of transition towards a regenerative era, and or both. But we are in transition. In that transition, our lives are filled with hypocrisy and they're filled with compromises and trying to feel into a moral compass inside for how to walk with integrity and to support the dismantling of systems and empires that are creating the harm in the world. There's a lot to unpack within what you said. And I would say that one of the first things that is required for any hope in our species is the willingness to feel difficult things, to allow ourselves to sit in the pain. So that can be said from feeling into right now that for those of us who are listening to this, or for the two of us recording, we are complicit in some form, or our modern needs and uses are part of a great tragedy happening right now as we speak, you know, and the numbers are unfathomable, like much bigger than what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Does not belittle what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And then to feel into also some of the reason that what's happened recently also has gotten so much global attention is the power of technology in communicating and showing on the ground what's happening and the horrors of it. We're literally watching a nightmare live. This is the new reality TV that I'm actually quite grateful for. And so there's all these contradictions that as we grow as a species, the only way we find the answers is by leaning into them and allowing ourselves to get uncomfortable. I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and this also ties to the redefinition in the beginning we were talking about around whiteness and what it has meant to be a white male as the pinnacle of the archetype behind the colonial capitalist patriarchy. And around that, we were talking about the emotions of shame and guilt, and that a lot of times you hear that shame and guilt is a bad thing to feel. We explored the possibility that shame and guilt are bad in excess because most of us feel them in overdose, and most of them feel it as a bludgeoning that's also a result of an upbringing that does not necessarily nurture self-love in all of us. And yet, shame and guilt are very important key emotions if felt in just the right amount to actually change the course of our actions. Or in this case, for example, to allow us to be guided and directed in our activism of different sorts by the shame and guilt we might feel by using these minerals, or by the shame and guilt someone might feel who in the beginning was the Israeli government supporter and is beginning to realize that perhaps they were wrong, and that even though everyone around them is behind this, maybe they're starting to feel something inside, and they feel shame and they feel the guilt of having, supported or stood up for something that doesn't actually feel good and right inside of them. And so there's something to be said about allowing those emotions in dose, and then also celebrating when people acknowledge and come forward from the alchemization of shame and guilt. So I don't believe in bludgeoning each other, don't believe in shaming each other, but I do believe that when those emotions arise, that they can actually serve for something that is conducive to a healthier future, both personally and collectively.
Absolutely. And I feel in all of this, it's also recognizing that our trauma is being used against us to disempower us. And actually, when you look at all these conflicts, it's capitalism, it's money, it's metals, it's oil and gas. And that's what's underneath all of this. And then we are being played in our traumas that we all have, because we have all inherited the trauma of thousands of years of violence and oppression, and that is there in all of us, activated in different ways. And that if we don't ground into that in ourselves and understand the colonization that's happened in the world and how it has affected us, no matter what side different ancestors may have been on, and if we don't understand how the witch hunts have affected what it is to be a woman and our connection with the earth and our connection to be healers as human beings, then we can easily be pulled into these narratives and have these narratives used to re-traumatize us and traumatize us even more and traumatize each other and have us up against each other, when it's actually really not about that. It's about resources and money and power.
And it's true what you're saying. Capitalism is the elephant in the room. It's the underlying guiding factor that's behind the scenes. And then there's like other layers that are, a part of this, kind of, but not really. Like what's happening right now is not about religion in Israel and Palestine. It's like a fraction of what is happening. What is actually behind the scenes, and as you illuminated, the majority of Israeli people tried to oust Netanyahu, who did not want him in power, and understood the threat that, was imminent of their safety by having such a fascist right-wing government. What's really happening also is profit-driven, hungry ghosts in leadership. That has been a key common thread throughout many, if not all, of these conflicts. It's a grab of resources. And that grab of resources is not from what, maybe the term arta in Sanskrit. It's not from abundance or wealth in an actually connected or sacred way, which is to have as much as you need to do your dharma well, dharma being your path and your purpose. If you look at everything in nature, that's exactly what's happening. To have just the amount you need to be doing what you do well. What we're seeing now is not wealth and abundance. What we're seeing now is a hoarding of resources. It's the hungry ghost energy where there is never enough. And that reality of what it means to be so profit driven that morals and ethics go completely out the door is a direct result of an economic system that globally spread through another form of colonialism that essentially supports and aids the sociopathic nature within humanity, the self-centered, completely disconnected from empathy, compassion, and unified consciousness. So when we look at, there's a lot that one can find about this hidden element within the Israel-Palestine conflict, including the UN reports of how much natural gas is there, including the contracts that Israel made just a few, I think, months before October 7th for the natural gas in Gaza. The Ben Gurion Canal Project is another really important one people can look up around what some of the driving motives are, both for the US and for Israel, in terms of power play and resources within that area. And it's a sad reality, but what I find important about radicalization, and again, I'm saying radical as in the Assata Shakur definition of taking things from their root, deeply important that we do that. And that's where intersectional awareness comes in, linking, climate issue with the oppression and racism of different ethnicities in the world, same with misogyny. So the importance of the radicality in this moment is to allow our paths of purpose in global revolution to actually look at what is the problem? What is the underlying common thread here? And what can we do about it? What are post-capitalist realities? What can we envision? And what is needed in these times of transition to begin to step away? Because a lot of times what we see is that people, the system is so strong that we do not dare to take a step outside of it. And I would argue that most of our physical and mental health takes a huge toll because of the systems in place, particularly capitalism. And so for those of us who have rumblings that are deeply sacred whispers from within us of there must be something else available to me and to all of us, those silent, subtle, but very, very powerful whispers must be listened to, given space. And oftentimes that requires acts of courage, great acts of courage, right? Leaving things behind, maybe for some period of time finding isolation because the others around us don't understand or don't see, the vision. And if you look at a lot of the great freedom fighters or even some of the religious figures of our time, like they were considered absolutely, batshit cuckoo. Were. And that's important to look at. And the same thing even around what does it mean to be a terrorist, right? Nelson Mandela was a terrorist on the terrorist watch list until 2007, right? Even post-apartheid, this is like, what, I think 17 years post-apartheid or something. And then the peaceful negotiations. So in the same way that if we look at the freedom fighters of the past and some of the great mystics of our path being seen as completely nuts, we'll also see that they were rebels. They were holding resistance. And what is important is that each and every one of our resistance is rooted in a love equal to all beings. I think that's a key difference between what is happening in one side, let's say, and the other, because the side is not Israel only and Palestine. The side is love and life and hate and murder and separation. Those are the sides.
Thank you. I'm just taking a moment to anchor that in my body and to remember that we can choose to pull out of like the that kind of happens in this space and where it's that if you stand for something, it also means this, this, and this, and come into a space where it's like, no, I am anchored in a space of love, in groundedness, in complete respect of the earth, in complete respect of human life, in complete respect of all of us having at least a little hope of living some of our wildest dreams. And that this notion of some lives being completely disposable and other lives being, do whatever you want, like, live a free life where you get to go anywhere and do anything, and blah, blah, that this is a space, a binary that we don't want to be in anymore. I feel that you bring in climate into all of this as well. It's the same thing. It's like, we know the science of climate. We have known it for a very, very, very long time. We have known that the way in which we are consuming, the way in which we are powering our world, the way in which we are living is not going in a good direction. We know it's like, how many more species have to go extinct? How many more lives have to be lost? How many more homes have to be torn apart for us to take this seriously as a global community? We are living in this time of such cognitive dissonance with this, where we know, and yet it doesn't get talked about by our leaders. And one of the things that I sometimes think about in all of this with war is like, what is the footprint of all of these weapons and all of these bombs and all of this destruction, and what is that also doing to our planet, as well as the human beings and all of these children and mothers and men that are there, like, trying to save what they can of their communities in the rubble. And it is just such an expanded time for our consciousness to be able to see that, despite knowing everything that we know, that things still happen the way that they happen, and to then be constantly receiving things. I'm sure you've had a lot of this during this war in particular, where you've been accused of all kinds of things. I know I have. And I know that so many people have. Being able to step out of that binary and say, like, I can care about this child's life without that meaning that I don't understand this, or I don't understand that, or I want these people to be hurt, or I hate this, or I hate that. Or, I mean, the most interesting one was that all people that care about Palestine are narcissists. Okay.
Right. It's absolutely insane. Again, projections, right? Because the majority of people who are standing up for Palestine globally right now have absolutely no direct link to Palestine. It could be going on comfortably in their little bubbles, having their teas and coffees and doing their things, and just try to forget about it, right? So it's the exact opposite of narcissism. The majority of people who are speaking out to support Israel are from a self-serving perspective, right, within the echo chambers of some link towards, not everyone, but the majority. There's a very powerful point you brought up about non-binary consciousness. So this is why intersectionalism deeply matters in our, the future, at least for me, of my wildest dreams. So non-binary consciousness, or sometimes I like to call it trans consciousness, allows us to hold seemingly contradictory truths at once. Actually, it's a paradoxical way of holding. So in this discussion, for example, the fact that Palestinian freedom and Jewish safety are not mutually exclusive together is a very important point. In fact, they're interwoven and codependent of each other. Like this, many more. To say, and ceasefire and the genocide in Gaza can also include end all anti-Semitism, and we have no room for any of that in our hearts either. We will fiercely protect the lives of innocent Jewish people, and as I said in the beginning, even those who we don't agree with or committed these atrocities, because it's not about continuing the cycle of violence and suffering. It's about breaking it. It's about stopping it. It's also stopping. It also requires not just sitting on the side, complicit and silent. Stopping it requires the active involvement of as many of us as possible. So in terms of that non-binary consciousness, it's key. It's key to our future. And as you said, like climate and the parallel here, again, another intersectional vantage point. Like if we look at what led humans to get to the point that we are now in how we treat the earth. If you look at the origins of the evolution of humanity, what we were doing through all of our acts, whether that's agriculture, whether that later became, electricity, and all of that was actually just for more safety, to be able to withstand the challenges and the threats of being alive, whether that be a bear coming to eat us, whether that be the cold of winter, and whether it be food shortage or drought. And so a lot of the evolution of technology is around keeping humans safe. At this point, we're no longer doing that. We have now gone into comfort and luxury beyond, right, safety. And that's why that principle of artha is important around wealth, having just enough for me to do my dharma well. But our excess of that is what has led as a species to the imbalance we've created within our ecosystem. And this is another form of genocide that has been happening, and that the impending doom is very real unless we lean into that reality. And so, looking at that same root, we see it in the Israel-Palestine conflict. The only way the Israeli government is getting away with this, whether or not their actual motives are around capital and profit and resource and power in the region, is that the people from within and outside who support this are convinced that this is the only way to keep themselves safe. So my question globally for us, both in climate and the evolution of humanity, as well as in this current war, is, are we willing to keep ourselves safe at all costs? Is that really the point of living? What kind of life do we choose to live so that at the end, at our deathbed, we can go in peace because we know we've lived well, not because we've elongated or had enough safety in our life to be able to get us to that point.
Thank you for tuning in. If you are enjoying this episode, do join our membership. For a small contribution, you can be part of our community, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and embodiment. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all. And you receive a number of benefits, such as monthly soul space, going deeper sessions, access to our library of workshops, and discounts on all our online and in-person experiences. Our membership is what makes us able to make this show and stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Head to allthatweare.org/membership to find out more and join today. There's something here that I feel is really important around our resilience as human beings and our ability to step into something. And one of the things that I've heard many times in this, but also in the work that I've been doing for years, is people say, well, I can't bring my attention to these children that are dying and look after my own child that's in front of me, or I can't give time and energy to the climate crisis because I'm just trying to pay my bills and I'm burning out and I'm struggling. And whereas I do believe that, we have to resource ourselves as much as we can to stay present, I also feel like there's a level of fragility within all of this that is quite hard to come to terms with, where there's something about the dominant culture that gets so kind of used to this comfort, as you said, and so sort of selfish around this comfort that everything else outside of it becomes impossible to engage in. And I was having this conversation. I was in a taxi and there was a woman driver, and she is an immigrant from a Ghanaian background, and we were talking about her teenagers, and we were talking about her sick dad, and I was talking about my journey with my mum, and she said to me, if my mum got sick now, like I would not be able to handle that. And I was like, of course you would, because that's what we do. There's a place, and if people can serve from a full cup, amazing. And if you've got a full cup, please, please, please share it. I have experienced in my own life, and I live with a lot of privilege, that my cup is often not full. And that what I am being asked to show up to in my like personal life, as well as in my work, is that it's not always possible to be fully resourced. And I am resilient, and I am able to show up with the love that exists in me and not be creating more harm, so that I'm so scared that I'm not full and I'm going to then create more harm, and I'm not able. It's like if I show up rooted in my love, then I know that that's better than not showing up at all. I know that I can, and I can always find more. And for those of us that have been watching what's happening in Gaza, we have now watched over a period of 40 days people without food, without water, without homes, going from place to place every night, dealing with epic grief. And still, I see videos of kids laughing. I see videos of men, like, with such love pouring from their bodies and their eyes. I know that we are capable of so much more. I know it. And I know that we have to move through some of this narrative around activism, that we have to change ourselves to change it's not about changing, but it's about, but that's one of those old kind of adages that, like, burnout, like it's all too much, like retreat, and come into a space where it's like, no, this is the work of being a human at this time. This is the way that things are shifting. We are in this place, this narrative war. Life is hard for so many in so many different ways. And we're going to find more and more resilience and more love and more rooting.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up. Part of this is that we don't know what our actual capacity is until we allow ourselves to stretch as far and wide as we possibly can, and for life to stretch us. And part of the mysteries of natural birth is that we think that we know our limits, but to actually birth a new world, we have to be taken beyond that. And there's an incredible initiation that happens to that you can experience throughout one's life, that is very similar to that teaching. And what you said, there's so much to unpack with it, but one of the key elements is that it is a illusion that our reality and our comforts and our little homes are independent from what is happening over there. It's only a matter of time before that catches up with our lives, within our nation states, or that of our children. That's why there's such a wave of solidarity in the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw it too, but now in particular, there's a wave of solidarity coming of historically oppressed people throughout the world, because we are so aware our liberation movements are interwoven and interconnected with each other. And the reason that many of these atrocities can happen is because there's enough good people who are keeping silent or doing their own thing, or who think that they can't turn their attention there because they have not even tried. This is not to say that those who do have severe PTSD should be looking at the images of Gaza, right? That's not what we're talking about. You're absolutely right that we need to be resourced. But I would even argue that for many, there is liberation from seeing the raw, the real truth of what is alive in our world. And then the step is to bring ourselves closer to liberating that energy, to transforming that energy in the world. This ability to dilate or to stretch ourselves wider than we think possible. I think that also comes from recognizing that our privilege is only a bad thing if we do nothing with it. And so part of being privileged is that you don't even realize you're privileged. It's actually not only exclusive to white people. I will speak for myself. as a light-skinned brown woman, was incredibly privileged. And only became more and more aware of the privilege of that through my dark-skinned African American sisters, over the years when I was younger. Same thing as, in terms of wealth, I grew up not in poverty. So many of us can have frames of privilege, right? I want to clarify that. But privilege in today's world, in times of transition, is only a bad thing if we sit silently with it and allow it to serve ourselves or the select few around us who we care about. And that same privilege has to do with our energetic privilege, with our emotional privilege. How many of us in the world now, the problems that would normally be driving us crazy in our life, we're just like not even so wrapped up in it because of what it is to view the realities of our world, what it also does and heals within us and our perspectives, our deluded perspectives. I have so little nonsense in my life in these last 40 days. And there's both my own intentional leaning into this process, but it's also part of the alchemy of what starts to happen when globally more and more of us lean into collective liberation and lean in knowing that even if it's uncomfortable, it is medicine. It is good for us. I remember that I took a few days actually away from looking at some of the more gruesome images because it's really, really difficult. You have to, many of us you just stop and cry for, and start wailing in the middle of nothing, right? It's not even the moments you expect that you can't cultivate a little space for let me cry now about what's happening in Gaza and the horrors of humanity. It just comes over you in a lot of moments where all of a sudden you've watched an image or somebody speaking very strongly and the wave of emotion arises. And thank God for the feminine revival of spirituality and mysticism, because many of us are now aware emotions are portals for both power and truth. And so we don't see those emotions as something bad. In those days that I was slightly disconnected and needed to take a step back, which was good. But what I realized is I actually had nothing really strong. My words lost their power as I was trying to write about what was happening. It's not that I wasn't informed. I was informing myself more through other articles and through the different organization and mobilization movements reporting. But I lost that deep human connection that goes beyond intellect and logic and whose lands was this really, and it's like when we feel the raw and the real and the guttural, it allows a deeper truth to arise. And the same thing I would say for anyone who's a supporter of Free Palestine that hasn't watched the images of October 7th should also do that to get a full picture. It's not going to make you stop saying Free Palestine, but it's going to give a full picture. It's going to allow us to understand more deeply what the fear and the horror that Jewish diaspora and Israeli citizens felt. Also will give more fuel to the arguments that one has and holds, right? That there's a difference in power here. This is not a thing that started on October 7th. We've been here for decades. But yeah, so to summarize that very powerful point that you brought forward, to dilate ourselves as a privileged people in order to drink in the realities of the world so that we can bring forward some form of the antidote necessary, even if that antidote is solely through the level of consciousness and presence that we hold, because that is where everything starts from. And it is a revolution in and of itself.
And even if it is to cry by yourself in a moment of utter grief, to know that that is a sacred act, that is you processing some of this collective grief and collective energy and moving us towards liberation.
And it is an act of great service to the heart of humanity, because the reason these things can happen is because there are many people not feeling. Their hearts have been hardened. That callousness is what allows this to be. So for every one of them, we need many more who are willing to feel, who are willing to have an empathetic heart, which is not an easy thing to have. It is not. It is a warrior's path, It is a warrior's path for anyone who has shed a tear for another in these days and beyond.
And with that, the remembrance that our hearts can break open and get stronger, and also a recognition that that doesn't happen for everyone. This was also part of the conversation that I was having with this beautiful woman in the taxi, was that I was expressing that through what I'm experiencing right now, like I am finding myself able to show up. I'm also melting at moments, and I'm needing to really lean into support in other moments. And I feel super overwhelmed in moments too. And I have cultivated a spiritual connection to my power, to a bigger energy that means that I also trust that I can get stronger and get more embodied through these processes. And I want to recognize that that's not what happens for everyone, that a lot of people break down and find themselves in spaces of mental illnesses and are not able to hold everything. So part of it is around strengthening our vessels so that we can be those warriors, and knowing that that's what we're showing up for spiritual practice for, not for love and light and everything being floaty and lovely, but to strengthen our vessels. And then with that, to cultivate enough discernment to keep ourselves like safe within that path of an open heart, and to be able to also extend that to our community so that we can see when somebody needs that extra support and that extra care and that extra love in what they're holding, and that's part of this skill, and that somehow this is been so missed out of the current spiritual paradigm we're in. And it's just so depressing that people feel like these energies that we can cultivate are just to like live this like, you know, flowy, successful, manifest millions thing.
And to have flowy dresses and bindis, right?
Well, I love flowy dresses and bindis.
But that's not the only reason you're on the spiritual path, is it?
It's not, no.
Yeah. And it's not a costume.
No.
Because it's an expression from within you.
Yeah.
And it's a fraction of that expression. Just a fraction, but a beautiful one.
Absolutely. And my bindi is a very deep ritual of connecting to my ancestors. It's a beautiful moment for me every day.
Absolutely. What you're saying also about the spiritual community in this moment is really important, in that this is a time of great revealing. And so it's revealing of what was there hidden in the shadows. And so we're seeing, for example, what spirituality is not. And it is not a costume. So it is surprising that many people who wore what otherwise others might have seen as someone who is a very spiritual being, whether that means flowing dresses and bindis, or whether that means, you know, whatever, sustainable material brands that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars, like that's not what makes someone spiritual, nor is it the type of food they have in their fridge, nor is it the certifications that they have,
or how many ceremonies they've been to,
or how many ceremonies. Especially, what is it then, is a very important question to ask ourselves in that moment by what we're seeing. I would even argue that love and light is another thing that's being redefined right now. It's being redefined. And there's nothing wrong with either of those terms. It's only wrong in the way that we have seen it manifested. So part of what is interesting is that those who are connected to the dark and to the shadow, to find healing there, but also to reclaim some of what has been excommunicated from the spiritual and value system, let's say, are the ones who are not surprised and who are speaking out right now. Those people, men or women, it's not only dark goddess traditions in general, but those people tend to be people who have some scar, either on their body, like, I'm not speaking physical body, but can be, but on their body or on their ancestors' body, that has initiated them into deep suffering enough to hold deep compassion. Because it is very easy to talk about oneness. There's a whole other thing to embody it. And we can talk about one, actually, I love this. Bob Marley's granddaughter came out to say, everybody likes to use, you know, my grandfather's song, One Love. But do they forget that the first line says, "Can you hear the children screaming? Hear the children screaming." And if that's not an important message for our current times, I don't know what is. To the spiritual community in particular, what has oneness actually meant to you? And how do we dilute and water it down to stay neutral? To think that neutrality is the way of love always is a absolute, it's ignorance and it's privilege that allows that.
And where I'm seeing love and light is in the people of Gaza and in how they are showing up for themselves and for each other and for the greater meaning behind what they're experiencing. And it's incredible. There aren't words for that level of courage, that level of devotion, and that level of resilience.
Yeah. And faith.
Especially faith.
And especially, it's so true. We need a whole other lexicon now to wrap our minds around the strength and the resilience of the people in Gaza. And the fact that we're seeing people who have had no food, no water for now over a month, pulling others out of rubble, carrying them on their back, just the amount of superhuman, I don't even know what it is, I don't know what it is, but it makes the rest of us aware of the difference between what we may experience around us or within ourselves. So, what we might experience around us or within ourselves, because it's illuminating to us what is available within human consciousness. I've seen videos of an older brother stuck under the rubble with the younger sibling whose back is crushed, and he's filming himself, the older brother, and he's talking to his little sibling, saying, pray to Allah, don't worry, my love, don't worry, my love. And I mean, this is a young boy, we're not even talking a teenager. What is required for that amount of strength and love? And it's not like they have a choice. They should not, it's just like the same thing as saying, we celebrate the martyred mothers of the world, and they should not be mothering in these isolated forms outside of the village in a capitalist system in the way that we are. We're not celebrating that. So in some ways, they should not be having to do this in any way. But what they are doing is actually a great service to the rest of us, to cut through the BS and the nonsense of our world so sharply, both with how they're responding to this atrocities and also to the whole context that has led us here. That's part of what is awakening the entire world,
And this is why so many people are saying we are not freeing Palestine. Palestine is freeing us. Because if you can truly witness that level of strength and faith and hold that up as a mirror to yourself and then be like, wow, okay. Like, how can I show up even just a little bit in that spirit in this world?
Absolutely. And even, as I'm talking to you, I'm feeling this just like in a lot of the advanced yogic traditions, to hold death as a close companion constantly. In the same way, for me, holding these atrocities very near and dear to me in these days, very close to my awareness, it has not made the deep-seated trauma and suffering worse. It's a liberating force. It's like it's catapulting me forward to not take any moment for granted, to not stay asleep, to not stay complacent and complicit. And so there is a forward movement happening from that, from imagining what it's like under the rubble right now, to imagine what it's like to, even before this war, the psychological warfare that was happening in Gaza in different ways, one of them being the sound of the drones overhead, consistently. I don't know if that's the case in the West Bank, but the level of terror that these people have been living under, and then the level of dehumanization, all of this, holding it within as a close companion of contemplation throughout the day, and information to guide our steps forward. It's a gift, as you said, is freeing us.
Yeah, I find myself feeling nauseous a lot during these days. And to bring it back to this like privileged spiritual world where we purge a lot in ceremony, where that's part of the process of purging. And it's like life is a ceremony. Like, this is it. You can go and have that experience of one night of releasing and of unity and this kind of sense of community and belonging and clearing and realization. But that is available in every single moment of the day. That is what is on offer in every moment of life, that there is constantly so much that is there, and some of it is so beautiful and some of it is so dark, and all of it in between, and we need to be here for all of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if that is how we carry our spirituality, we're going to see a very different manifestation of spirituality in the world. If we start to really look towards, as Rosales Mrs. spoke, she said, if your spirituality allows you to stay silent for a genocide, what does it actually serve? And so there's something here around the reclamation, the understanding of collective liberation. And I would love to share actually a poem from Jaya John, one of my mentors, and a really powerful, he's a freedom worker, through his words. And he says, let it not be said of you that when they came for your neighbor around the block, you slept. When they came for your neighbor down the street, you slept. When they came for your next door neighbor, you slept. When they came for you, you cried out for your neighbors. None came, for they were all sleeping on you. He wrote this many, many years ago. But there's something in that intelligence to keep in mind here, around the unified field of human life and the entire web of life. And for us to really take each moment as a treasure, to use it wisely, to let our spirituality be informed by the deep grief in our world, by the collective trauma, to not turn away from historical horrors or present day horrors, to let it to inform spirituality today.
Just taking another breath to allow the words and the energy that we are sharing here to really come alive in the cells of our bodies and in the cells of the bodies of our friends listening, and to really deeply honor everyone that is choosing to show up in this moment and to wake up and to face the darkness of our world.
It's an incredible time right now, because even though we don't have the microphones or we don't own the microphones, but the majority of people in this world are standing up for love. They're standing up for solidarity and collective liberation. And it is so inspiring, and we have to allow ourselves to drink in the triumphs, because otherwise the despair alone is not enough. That's also what can sink many of us, or bring about apathy, because it feels like too much. And to orient, for example, not just around, oh, this in this community or people are being silent, but to orient around how many people are waking up, are rising up, who never have before. It's a beautiful time to see also that I think the word activist is also being redefined. It's not reserved. Activism should never have been reserved to the few. And within oppressed people, there aren't leaders or voices, but everyone is an activist, And in that same way, right now, let activism not be reserved to the quote unquote activists, because hopefully we're all active in bringing about a more beautiful world that is possible.
Absolutely. I was at the book launch of Jen Bendel's book, Breaking Together, and I don't know if the panel will ever make it onto a podcast. It's meant to go on a different podcast. And somebody, did the whole kind of like, they brought race into it, and I was in a room where I was the only person of color, and I was like, great, I haven't had breakfast. Yes, it's a Sunday. Let's do this. And one of the questions was around how activists are often like a certain kind of person, or this notion of privilege around it. And I feel like what I wanted to share, and it feels really important to share here, as we're redefining activism, that you have to just be an activist in the way that your life allows you to be, that makes sense for who you are and what is happening in your life. And we have this notion of the people that are activists, but most people in the world are activists, especially in the global south. It's just a way of life that you're having to live in a way where you're honoring community, where you're honoring the future, where you're finding ways in your community to come up against the climate challenges or the other challenges that you face, where you're sharing the food that you have. Like that, these are just ways of being actually a human. And it's so funny that we've then turned this into a kind of a thing. And there is the activism for those that have more privilege is to bring voice into the systems of power, and that is a very particular type of activism that we need everyone to do if they can, and not to lose hope in the power of protest and the power of sharing one's voice and the power of signing the petitions, lobbying parliamentarians. All of these things all act towards it, and that is alongside what can we do in our own lives to be living the values around us that we are representing, and how can we connect our energy to alignment with our integrity and with the earth and with that deep love that we have as human beings. And it's all of it. It's both and.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I want to add to that one form of activism, which is art. And I don't reserve art to the artist, quote unquote. I reserve art to anyone who tries to make their life a work of art and who prays in whatever form to the gods of creativity. And the beautiful thing about that is that it's a regenerative force. It's a force that circumvents the intellect and goes straight to the heart. And a lot of times, I think that if we're playing it safe in our art, it will only go so far. And I've noticed that bit and bit in myself, that the more I'm willing to explore and touch and not have the answers to, but to bring my inquiries around the collective, around the future of humanity, around the injustices of the world, if I bring them into my art, then a very strange and mysterious things happen, which is that the art begins to teach us and begins to illuminate us. And then it's a co-creation always, art. And so in that same way, I've felt that applicable to our lives. And art, activism, as art as activism, is a very powerful tool that will always be in the side, in the hands of the people, in the hands of love. It will never be, it's not something that can be close to as powerful as what the other side may have. They might have more weapons. They might even have, weapons of mass destruction and destroy the entire, human race in a heartbeat. But to not underestimate the power of beautiful, rooted, raw, real art.
Thank you for landing us with that. And everyone has heard some of your art at the beginning of this conversation, and how it can transport so much of everything that's complicated and that we can't grasp with our rational intelligence into something that we can understand, that can transform us.
And hopefully something that we can feel. I forget who this was, but one of the great painters, surrealist painters, said a successful piece of art is art that makes you feel something. That doesn't always mean that it has to know exactly everything. It's not trying to recreate truth in some way, but to elicit feeling. That is a very beautiful compass also, again, for our work outside of what is the traditional form of art, but for the works of art in our life and in our work.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a bit about Mother Tongue? and this new expression of your work that you're offering?
Yeah, absolutely. Mother Tongue is a online learning collective and portal for creativity and consciousness rooted in nature-based spirituality and intersectional activism. And so we have a membership platform and then also courses regularly that are bringing and bridging matters from decolonization to creative expression to the feminine revival and the reclamation also of the feminine, not to be confused with femininity. And essentially, it's a birth from my own understanding of what it is that I'm aligning my life towards. And that is to speak and to listen in what I call the mother tongue. It's the original language before language, the language that nature speaks in. It's a language that the essence of nature speaks in within the human as well. It's the language of birds. It's the bridging point between structure and, let's say, freedom and fluidity, the bridging point between intellect and esoteric, that paradoxical nature that we were talking about earlier on in this conversation is available to us in the mother tongue. It's the language of dreams, the language of poetry, and also the language of realness for revolution. So they say that you create that which is the medicine you yourself most need. and I've created this collective that brings in different teachers and visionaries in the world, and that I'm a curator for and also a teacher in, but because it's exactly the medicine that I've been hungry for in the world.
Beautiful. What is your call to action that you want to leave us with?
Well, actually, I had one that I found out recently is no longer an option, but I'm going to share it anyway because it's also the intention, which was there's a global convoy of conscience that was happening from Cairo to the Rafah border, calling particularly European citizens to come as an act of solidarity for Gaza and to impact close to the ground to show the world the support, and the stance that we take. And so, however, the Egyptian government has decided to not provide safe access for this group, and so it had to be delayed. I'm going to share with you my similar initiative, which I've started, and I don't know if we're in conversation with activists within Egypt and liaisons with the government to see if we can do this. But I had what I can only describe as a divine inspiration to gather people in a similar initiative, but who are willing to be human shields for the people of Gaza, who are preferably from privilege, meaning ideally US or European national citizenship, ideally not people of color, but still welcome. I would be a part of it, to do a pilgrimage to the Rafah border and to find a way through into Gaza. Ideally, that's the difficult part, and to put our bodies in harm's way for the protection of innocent lives. And maybe our governments will think twice if their own citizens are there on the line. That initiative I'm putting out there as a potential, depending on how these next talks and negotiations information goes. But actually, what I'm putting out there is not even the specific initiative, but the essence, the intention behind that initiative, which is to use our privilege to get as radical as we possibly can, stretch ourselves, because this is really the last chance that we have as a humanity. We don't have space or time to sleep. We don't have space or time to sit in the deluded bubbles of comfort that we're in. And so, where and how can we give the antidote, right, to hate and horror as much as possible? Self-sacrifice in the name of love, self-love in the name of love in equal proportion.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. And it also really makes me just want to mention this in case people listening don't know this, but so many of the people in the kibbutz whose families were killed on October the 7th have said, please no more, not in our name, not in my family's name. That there's so many peace activists involved in that violence, and this is the thing that to really wake up that peace activist in all of us.
And a lot of those people speaking out within Israel, and especially those who are connected to the hostages, saying this is not in service to saving the hostages. A lot of those people are being persecuted, are having to go into hiding, or are being shamed by their community and tribe. So I say that just to be aware. When you start speaking truth, many of us will have to encounter that.
And I also want to add that that's why you and I are having this conversation, because I don't want to put any Palestinian or Israeli humans that are up in this, that are in all the trauma, in any more danger. And we, as we are slightly removed, we can have this conversation. We're being informed by what they're sharing, but not asking them to come here and give their energy to teach us. And also, as so many of them are having to go into hiding and all of this, that we keep them safe. Ebyan, how can people connect with you? Can you share your website?
Yeah, so we can put it in the show notes.
Yes.
Yeah, mother-tongue@micahjabi.com, and Ebyan Zanini on Instagram. And from there, you can see all of my work. And I have a Substack that I'll be publishing within the next month with poetry and musings and love letters about life. And hopefully each day more and more beautiful future of humanity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you, Amisha.
Yeah, and you. I feel so much more grounded in my love and in solidarity. And I really hope that that's what everyone that listens to this conversation feels.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. You choose what you contribute based on our sliding scale, and you become a patron whose support makes this podcast happen, as well as receiving access to a library of many resources and invitations to nourishing events. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. Me, Amisha Gadiali, producer and host, Anna Greta Folderbach, who crafts the words that accompany each episode, and Mary Chan, who edits the sound so skillfully. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.